A lot of things that I see is where people have issues is chronic under recovery, and a lot of times that's disguised as ambition. Where I see leaders wear exhaustion as a bandage, sleep as an afterthought, and treat their nervous system like it has unlimited bandwidth. When your nervous system is depleted, it just doesn't affect the individual. It affects every decision in every room and every person that the leader touches. So the judgment and the emotional regulation and the strategic thinking are biological functions. Chronic active stress response, which is a real thing, was never designed to run for years at a time. So that's why, remember you have like 7 days in the week and on Sunday was your day of rest. And burnout is what happens when chronic stress exhausts not only the chronic stress is there, it also it depletes the physiological reserves that we have that show up as typical exhaustion, cynicism, and a drop in efficiency. That willpower alone can't even reverse. AI has introduced a new category of uncertainty because for some people, it feels like rather existential, than situational. And when people can't predict what their role is or what it will be in 3 years from now, 2 years from now, the nervous system takes that on as a threat. If you don't have good sleep, it degrades your memory and judgment. And if you don't have a good nervous system, when your nervous system is overload, it keeps your body constantly in fight or flight. If you ask me what a leader should stop doing and start doing, they should stop treating exhaustion as proof of commitment. I mean, that's what we started our conversation with today.
Yeah.
And they should start measuring their performance inputs with the same rigor that how they apply it to business, and protect your recovery time as fiercely as you protect your clients' relationships, because ultimately you are the asset.
Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Tech Talk podcast. I'm your host, Saumitra Kalikar. In corporate environments, when we talk about resilience, we often talk about technology resilience, cyber resilience, and business resilience. But there is one thing that gets far less attention than it deserves, and that is the resilience of human operating system. The leaders in particular today are expected to absorb constant pace of change, respond to market pressures quickly, and make faster decisions. And nowadays, they are also expected to navigate the uncertainty created by artificial intelligence. But underneath all of this, there is a real question that needs to be unpacked. That is, how long these leaders can sustain high performance if their health, their energy, and their resilience are quietly getting depleted. And this is the focus of today's conversation. And to unpack this really important topic, I'm joined today by Dr. Pat Boulogne. Dr. Pat is a performance optimization strategist, an executive coach, and international best-selling author. She has more than 30 years of clinical and functional medicine experience. Dr. Pat, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here. And this is a sector that AI and that sector of tech always really, really interests me. I don't know if I understand all of it, but I certainly always have my ears open. And I like to see people sustain that performance of that they work so hard to get to where they're at. And that's something that you pointed out, which is the reason why we're here and having this conversation today.
Yeah. So, Dr. Pat, you would have, over your journey as a clinician and performance optimization coach, you would have had close view of many high-achieving professionals, right? How they operate and how they break down. So, my initial question is, what are the common patterns or behaviors you see within these high-achieving professionals who appear successful from the outside, but maybe from inside they are under significant strain?
Well, a lot of things that I see is where people have issues is chronic under recovery, and a lot of times that's disguised as ambition. where I see leaders wear exhaustion as a bandage, sleep as an afterthought, and treat their nervous system like it has unlimited bandwidth. The pattern is consistently high output early and then slow erosion from clarity, patience, and decision quality as they attribute that where they have a tendency to attribute that to being just busy. I'm just busy. I'm a little bit, I'm a little bit, edgy today, that type of thing, rather than looking at the physiological cost of that.
And when you look at these patterns, what do they tell us? Yeah, do you see the relationship between the health of high-achieving professionals and their performance?
Well, it's, a lot of times, when you're looking at performance issues, it's not in their stress and their burnout, and it truly affects, we all know, their performance issues. And it's not just a personal well-being topic. And the reason for that is because when your nervous system is depleted, it just doesn't affect the individual. It affects every decision in every room and every person that the leader touches. So the judgment and the emotional regulation and the strategic thinking are biological functions. And we frame that as health, as personal well-being. So it isn't something that's optional. When we frame it as a performance input, it becomes a leadership responsibility.
And I wanted to unpack that because when you look at most of the organizations today, they offer wellness as one of the employee benefit programs typically. But when the leaders are under stress, under pressure, that doesn't really typically remain personal, right? Because that affects the teams, that affects the decision quality, etc. So, in your view, where does the health, stress, burnout, etc., should that be treated more of a performance issue than just a well-being program within the organizations?
Well, I think they need, a lot of, one of the problems that, I wrote an article a couple years ago about, burnout. And that one of the things that, when you're looking at like wellness programs and that in that integration of that, um, you can't have a cookie cutter type program. You have to, a lot of times people are not looking at performance. They're not looking at the diet. They're not looking at their personal, physical, emotional, and social well-beings. They're looking at, and the ultimate thing is that you're making decisions based upon, a certain amount of energy that you can expel at a specific time. So when I talk to a lot of people, there's that, it affects the nervous system, in regards to that. So you have to have something more than just like, hey, do this diet. We're going to do a challenge. You really have to look at what's happening with the person's cognition, how much sleep they're getting, the quality of sleep. You have to look at what kind of foods they're eating, because some foods can make you have brain fog, and create more inflammation. You have to take a look at, the quality of sleep, the sleep hygiene, and then you have to look at that mindset piece of it. It's that personal, the resilient mindset. Resilient mindset doesn't happen. It doesn't become robust like overnight. You have to feed it the right food. You have to feed it the right thoughts. So a lot of the self-talk that you're talking through, as you talk through three brains, and the three brains you talk through are the lizard brain or the primitive brain, the mammalian brain, and I speak also to the conscious brain. So if it's getting the wrong information, then you have this, you're getting a lot of mental fatigue for no apparent reason. And I think you have to have the right programs in place to help support people so that they can even be better. And a lot of it always goes back to what you're putting in your mouth.
Right. And in the corporate environments nowadays, the leaders often face multiple pressure scenarios simultaneously, whether is a pressure because of the economic uncertainty, whether it is because of AI disruption or regulatory disruption, whatever it could be, right? But the point here is they continuously are under pressure. So that starts becoming to what you also said is becoming in a constant phase of being under pressure, chronic
Mhm.
pressure. And you touched base on this a little bit, but I want to understand how the long-term effect, what are the long-term effects are on for being under pressure for a long time on the cognitive abilities, decision-making skills, etc.
Well, the uncertainty and information overload that you talk about and the transformation fatigue, and you said economic pressure also, in the rising expectations of people who are leaders, like, you can't, you have to, your inclination is to always do more as opposed to really protecting your space. And that stack forces people to make, it's a constant uncertainty that keeps the nervous system on a low threat state. So remember that primitive brain I talked about? That's what we're talking about. It's always going like, oh, you don't have to do that. And the middle brain goes, oh, remember when you did this? This is what happened. And they all talk to each other. So that added information and that overload and what it does is it transforms fatigue that the brain never gets a true, clear signal to downshift into recovery because it's always on. And it doesn't know when to stop. So it's when you're constantly under stress, when people don't get enough sleep, they actually act like they're drunk. They have the same mechanisms and the same brain pattern, from sleep deprivation. And the result of that, what happens is that chronic active stress response, which is a real thing, was never designed to run for years at a time. So that's why, remember you have like 7 days in the week and on Sunday was your day of rest. For some people don't. I mean, I've worked on Sundays too, but but you don't do it all the time. That's why you take vacation. That's why and when you take vacation, you really need to turn everything off and get yourself out of your environment.
Yeah, yeah. Interestingly, when you look into our corporate environments, what I observed, and you would have noted this as well, that many leaders, sadly, I would say, they consider these high pressure situations as a kind of badge of honor, in the sense
Hmm.
that, having a long day hours, having poor sleep, or back-to-back meetings, etc. They feel that that is a sign of commitment to work, right? But they don't realize potentially as to what are the impacts, long-term effects that is having on their cognitive and physical body. But how do you address this mindset? What are the risks that carries?
Well, when you're looking at cortisol dysregulation and you're looking at the architect of like the sleep portion of that and the inflammatory overload, the patient, excuse me, I'm used to being in an office this week, how your emotions become very narrowed and you almost have this there's a fog around it. So you're not making, the decisions that you want to have. So it's kind of like a false trade-off.
Mm.
And that depletion that somebody has as a senior leader, or any type of leader, is that you have underlying systems that support the leader, but they're not being optimized. It's just like I used to be able to do that. I could like keep up with 24-year-olds when I was 50 years old. I'm 70 now. Can I keep up with 24-year-olds? I can, but I know that people who are in constant roles where they have demands that, and they have deadlines and they don't have enough support, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, or social, then what happens is that there's that trade-off. And cortisol happens to be one of those dysregulations when you start getting like fat around the organ systems, and fat in your belly, and it just never goes away. And you have, and then if you're not sleeping well, so many people tell me, like, what can I do to sleep better? And I have a whole list: sleep in a dark room, make sure the room is cool enough and that you're not too hot. Make sure that, when you go to sleep, if, and you tell yourself it's okay to go to sleep, because you're going to have that self-talk. Because if you can, I talked about the primitive brain or the lizard brain. If you can control the conversation you're having with that brain, then you can control a lot of your other outcomes. So there wouldn't be a false trade-off. There wouldn't be a depletion, in how someone's functioning and how in that on those 5 levels that I always talk about: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and social. Um, and that's what happens when someone no longer normalizes that depletion. And the good way to change that is like, and I give the example of, I have people just stop eating bread, rice, and rice and pasta. Okay,
Mm.
I knew I'd get it. And when you do that, and then stay away from it for 30 days, I said, go add one of them back in your diet and see how well you respond. And someone's like, well, I didn't have a problem with rice, but I had a problem when if I went to eat pasta again. I was exhausted. I wanted to go to sleep an hour later. That's your body telling you that you're not regulating that food and you probably shouldn't eat it. You probably should cut it out of your diet for quite a while.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? This is an example.
Yeah, as an example, definitely makes sense. And could be other suggestion. Could we just keep mobiles away? Uh, have a good sleep. But you also leaders tend to keep themselves connected with the work even after the work hours, so, and they feel that the connection, making themselves available, is important. So how leaders should kind of break these kind of habits to have a very clear work life balance?
Well, it's really important. Like, turn your phone off. It's just like, and you want to see someone stress out a little bit, it's just like, turn your phone off. Don't have it next to your head. Your telephone emits electromagnetic frequencies, and it can interrupt how you're sleeping. Don't have the Wi-Fi box in your bedroom when you're going to sleep. Have your Wi-Fi box as far as possible away from you. Wi-Fi signals go down, they don't go up. So when you have it more in the attic or on the second floor, then it can spread out. So, but never have it any place where you need to be productive.
One thing, other point I wanted to unpack with you, Dr. Pat, was the impact of the burnout, the chronic condition of being in stress. And just building on what we discussed so far, is sometimes burnout, people don't feel they're burnt out. Uh, and there is a difference between it, to me, is what I would call as productive stress, that is stress for a short time, for a particular need, for a 1 week or few couple of days, because there is important work to be closed out, versus you are being in that condition for a continuously long period, right? And people don't realize they are transitioning from a productive stress to a burnout condition. So, for leaders or for, people in general, what are the early signals they should they should realize that now they are actually getting into the chronic condition?
Uh-huh. So do you remember we just talked about the 3 brains? Keep those in mind, because the conscious brain is what we're talking on right now. The mammalian brain is everything that's ever happened to you. It is stored so that you have accessibility to that, like how to respond to something, or it's just like, oh, last time I ate that, I got sick. I don't want to eat it again. Um, and then you have the primitive brain, lizard brain. And so remember those, because the primitive brain, its goal is to just, protect you, save you from the saber tooth, make sure you're eating, make sure you're replicating yourself. So the difference between the productive stress, the chronic stress, and the burnout that you're talking about, the productive stress, it's always going to be functioning between those 3 brains. But the productive stress sharpens your focus. And when the situation is over, it's done, you feel relief, right? You can like, wow, I can decompress now. And chronic stress is something that, is activated. There's no resolution. The body never gets a signal to shut down, take time out. It's just standalone, and you constantly are going. And that's what a lot of people struggle with so much, because then chronic stress becomes your new norm. And we all know what happened when we just, had that new norm go on. And burnout is what happens when chronic stress exhausts not only the chronic stress is there, it also it depletes the physiological reserves that we have that show up as typical exhaustion, cynicism, and a drop in efficiency. that willpower alone can't even reverse. So when you're burnt out, you're just like sometimes you're lethargic, or you have this you're going through motions, and you realize you're like, wow, it's like driving a car, and all of a sudden you get to your point to where you're going. You're thinking, I don't really remember that drive. But I know that I got here safe, and you're thinking, I don't ever want to do that again. So you start, it's like, it's a signal, it's a red flag for you to pay attention.
And you also talked about and written about what you describe as performance intelligence method, Dr. Pat, if I understand correctly. I wanted to understand that as a bit more. What is that about, and how does that help leaders to uncover their hidden constraints?
Well, a lot of times, hidden constraints, people remember that mammalian brain.
Mhm.
All those hidden constraints are in that brain, and your body knows them, but the talk that your primitive brain says, oh, you can do it, you can work through it, you don't need that much sleep. Go out and have that dessert. It's going to make you feel better. It might make you feel better for the moment, but it creates a lack of recovery. Your energy becomes more unstable. And when these constraints operate, they operate below your conscious level. So it's subconscious. So the conscious is what we're talking with. Subconscious is the mammalian brain, and the lizard primitive brain. And that's where it's a little bit dangerous, because, if you don't have good sleep, it degrades your memory and judgment. And if you don't have a good nervous system, when your nervous system is overload, it keeps your body constantly in fight or flight. And you don't want to be there, because you're constantly thinking, it's when you're driving, if you ever like take those long trips and you're going, I can do this 14-hour trip in one thing. You're pretty good maybe for the first 6 or 7 hours you get out in the stretch, but that last amount of that drive puts you in a position of decision fatigue. Then all of a sudden you realize, oh, I'm floating across the lane, and now I'm on the side of the road. Now my car's turned over, and, nobody wants to have those disasters in their life. And the energy becomes, very unstable. So your blood glucose levels, or hormonals, which are hormonal driven, are, they're creates those afternoon crashes. So the crashes usually come at about 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock afternoon, and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so that's when people could have to have that cup of coffee. That's when people like want to have that sweet, in order to help bring them up. But it's really not great for your blood sugar, because it doesn't keep it, more balanced. And that's why I see a lot of leaders like wearing blood sugar monitors. And it's so that, they know when they eat something, they can see their blood glucose levels like skyrocket. And you're thinking, why am I eating that? It's a good like biofeedback mechanism that helps support that. So you can get rid of those afternoon crashes, and also eating properly, so that there's a thing called the zone diet. Zone diet was made by Barry Sears. He's a medical doctor that's a researcher. And when you balance out your proteins, your fats, and your carbohydrates based upon what your protein requirement is, and I help people with this all the time, and then it shows up like if you're an athlete, you run longer, you run more evenly, you burn fuel, the right kind of fuel during the daytime, so that, you don't have an issue in the afternoon. I just got done working 3 full days in a doctor's office that normally sees what I saw in 3 days and 5. And so someone like, how do you do it? And I just said, I eat really well, I sleep well, and I don't let anything disturb my peace of mind. I like it that, therefore I stay away from the news during that week. But and then I eat, I'm very, like my decision is like, I don't have decision fatigue. And I don't have my energy is like going strong. I ended up having an emergency patient last night in this office, helping this doctor out, and I was there an extra hour. So my day started at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I didn't leave there until 7:15 at night. That's a long day, and so and then and you have to have your mind needs to be sharp. You have to be aware. And sometimes when we can create better awareness, we're like aware like certain people drain your energy, certain foods drain like my energy. It makes me want to go to sleep. So if you eat something and you're sleepy an hour later, or a half hour later, you ate the wrong thing. That's not the thing to eat for optimization. So,
Yeah.
we want to make sure that, what shows up, is to have the awareness about how these things occur. And then when they happen, let's like, okay, I know what that is. I know exactly what I have to do to, like to change that trajectory so that it doesn't affect the rest of my day.
And what are the good, so small but good habits leaders should develop on day-to-day basis to make sure they remain productive, efficient throughout the day? Because leaders typically they live in this environment of ambiguity. They need to continuously make new decisions, right? There could be a new program that needs to start. There could be new investment decision they need to make, or there are new risks they need to address, so on and so forth, right? And that's a day-to-day expectation from them. Um, I want to understand just small but really important practical habits they should develop, whether it's their habits about the quality of food, whether it's a habit about um, the regular schedule within the office, within the work, whether they should take breaks, how many breaks they should take in between. Are there any specific tips you want to give?
Well, I can give a really simple tip, and I have a little bit of a dialogue, after I tell you, because I think one of the biggest things that when people get injured, I'm a sports physician also, and I have that history in functional medicine. The biggest thing that I see, like in anybody, you don't have to be a sports person to have dehydration.
Mm,
Majority of people, when they don't sleep well, they're not hydrated, and you need that hydration because you need it for every cell, organ, and tissue in the body. So one of the biggest things is make sure that you get enough hydration based upon your body weight. And then in the States, it would be, you would take, if you weighed 100 pounds, should drink at least a minimum of 50 ounces of water, not just any water. Because you don't want to drink. In the United States, there's an issue with like chlorine, fluorine. It's like, I'm sure it's like that in Australia also. And there's chemicals that are in water. There's some of them and there are neurotoxins, and you want to avoid them. So it's really important to drink more purified water that has a very low total dissolved solids, or it's called TDSs. And there's certain type of water products that you can do by like reverse osmosis. You can use a filter that takes out a lot of those impurities and things so you don't want to be drinking plastics, because plastics never ever leave your body. So, but the hydration is important and the quality of the water is important. If you really want to make water really work for you even more, if you put a little bit of cider vinegar in it or lemon juice, that lemon juice, is what I usually use. And that is like brings up the right kind of acid in it. So it maintains the right kind of acid in your stomach. So it helps balance out the pH to where it's supposed to be. Because if it drives too low, then you have like stomach burn, right? And then you have to, I'm not want to get into the logistics too much, but you wanted to make the reason for the lemon juice is because it helps, keep the pH of the stomach. It also is a blood purifier. It helps the liver do its job. It helps the gallbladder do its job. And you need your gallbladder because the gallbladder, it puts the bile in your stomach so it protects it so that the acid doesn't burn through holes through it.
mm.
So that one thing of water, it does so many things. Like if you work out, you need it for your joints. If you sleep, you need it for your brain so your brain can detox, because the brain detoxes when you're sleeping.
Yeah, yeah. And what about the food habits as well, Dr. Pat? Because I often see, in again when about particularly the senior leaders, they are always in demand. They have one meeting to another, followed by another meetings, etc. And they typically compromise on the other habits, like your personal habits like food. But when they're actually into the important meetings where the important strategic decisions are to be made, how important it is for them to have a very balanced diet, regular on time regular lunches, etc.?
I was in acupuncture school at the age of 53 or something like that. I studied in Mandarin. I didn't study in English and
Right.
or pinyin. And so the what I found, and I always said this even when I had my practice, I go, if you want to be an excellent performer, if you want to run like the Kenyan runners, if you want to, have that, mental clarity so that you can make a decision on a drop of a dime, and that you have to eat so clean that, it's not negotiable. So, um, and it doesn't mean you can't ever have like an occasional dessert, but I would tell you to completely avoid sugar. That would be my other recommendation besides the water. Because when you eat those things, you end up having decision fatigue, you have energy instability, and and they all show up in your performance. So one of the things that would be really crucial for that is having an objective assessment. So there's no guesswork. I don't guess, I test. And I have a specific way that I look at biomarkers and recovery patterns and cognitive load together so that you can pinpoint a specific constraint, because what you need to eat and what I need to eat in order to achieve that result might be two totally different things. And where some people can handle a carbohydrate load, other people can't handle a carbohydrate load. Like nobody who's an excellent performer who runs eats carbohydrates anymore before a race. You're not going to last. You eat things to have that the muscles need in order to be able to, effectively move smoother and lighter. But you can't run smoother or lighter. I don't, everyone has a big Christmas dinner. You would never go out and run right after that. It's just
Yes.
everyone's, wants to go to sleep, right? And if you do that, like when you talked about board meetings, you talked about being in a meeting and eating on the run, some of those things, you aren't looking at what the ingredients are. And there's so many hidden sugars in food.
Mhm.
It's much better to have that Caesar salad with, salmon or Caesar salad with very lean meat on it than it is to have, than to have that, that sandwich, that chicken sandwich, or something that has a lot of carbohydrates. Because a lot of chicken, has a product in it called sugar, and that's one of the preservatives that they use in it. So, it's so there's no like guesswork about it. It's like I say at the very beginning, I said, stay away from bread, pasta, and rice. And that would be like a big, huge thing. 'Cause I've had people who lost inches around their waistline just doing that one thing. But I have a very, very specific protocol for people to follow for at least 2 weeks to see if that kind of food plan is the best food plan for them.
I want to unpack a specific agenda with you, which is more about the what I call it AI anxiety, artificial intelligence anxiety, because AI disruption is has a significant impact nowadays on corporate environments, and that impact is at every level within the corporates. For example, every employee, the anxiety is all about whether my job will be relevant in next few years, whether my skills will be relevant, how should I build my career over the next 2 3 years, so on and so forth. And whereas at the leadership level, the anxiety and for expectation is all about what does AI mean for my business. So, do you have any specific advice or observation on AI?
Well, first off, AI, we all have to agree that first off, on a bell curve, we're still going up.
Yes.
We haven't tipped, right? And so AI has introduced a new category of uncertainty because for some people, it feels like rather existential, than situational. And when people can't predict what their role is or what it will be in 3 years from now, 2 years from now, the nervous system takes that on as a threat. And it's an ongoing threat. So remember, we just got talking about chronic stress, that ongoing threat compounds all of the pressures. So there's a line that says, fear's false appearances appearing real, right? And so, but we don't know what the uncertainty is. But we have to say, like, is that true? Well, it could be true. And it's like, and based upon what we've seen so far, makes people feel even more, um, it makes people feel even more uncertain because they just don't know. And when they don't know, they're constantly like, they don't digest their food, they don't sleep well, and they make bad decisions. You can't make a clear decision unless you have clear focus,
Mm.
and so it's that, um, it's like learning to control and learning to be able to adapt, because the success of any species is this ability for adaptation.
Yeah. And I wanted to build on that because that was my next question as well, Dr. Pat. Yes, within the corporate environments, the expectation nowadays is that you need to be more adaptable, you need to absorb new changes continuously, etc. But how how can individuals, normal common employees, build that adaptability when they are under fear, continuous fear of losing their job? How that fearful mindset help them or stops them from being more adaptable?
Well, one of the thing is that, like I said, remember the false experiences appearing real?
Mm.
It's like we need to focus on what's always been true. And we need to focus on our ability to learn and adapt and regulate under pressure. And that's the actual asset that's in your back pocket. It's not a single skill set. So I encourage clients to audit what their energy looks like, what their recovery system looks like first,
Mm.
because adaptability is a physiological capacity before it's a strategic one. And you can't out strategize a depleted nervous system.
One question I have, and I wanted to understand with you is, we talk about individuals to how we can actually bring more, make them more resistant and resilient and improve their health. But there is something about overall health of or a healthy environment, I would say, within an organization at organizational level as well. Um, do you have any specific view or position on that as to how, apart from building healthy individuals, how organizations should build a healthy environment culture with?
Well, I think that in corporations, that being resilient puts the burden entirely on the individual to withstand a broken system. And designing a health performance culture means that the organization examines its own contribution and the workload design in meeting cultural and leadership behavioral issues, as well as building an environment where resilience isn't required to survive. Because when you have a robust, resilient mindset, for some people it comes naturally, but being resourceful is a crucial tool and be able to have and adapt also.
Yeah, yeah. Look, as we start wrapping up, Dr. Pat, I have some more focused questions just to get more practical tips for our audience here who are business leaders, executives, etc. Um, because many of these senior leaders, while they might have intention to improve the health of themselves and their teams, etc., typically they get bogged on with the time constraints, back-to-back meetings, and so on and so forth. So, if an executive who might be listening to this episode and that person wants to start with, let's say, a 30-day reset um, for themselves, um, what would you recommend or how they should start?
Well, one thing they can do, because real change means structural change, right? And then
Yeah.
and in your realism for staffing and actual capacity, you have to take a look at, like what can you do for recovery norms? Like what can you do for meeting, like mental hygiene so that you're not feeling like you're being like Like you need to bring in like a mental tool for yourself so that you can barrier. So things that I tell people that they can do for simple recovery is to go out, and I could call it hugging a tree, taking in my office that I had on Cape Cod, I used to have a large rock that was about 5 pounds. And anybody, if somebody was having that, they weren't part of the team where they were struggling. They had an opportunity to go outside, sit down in the sun for 15 minutes, and just tone out, come back in, and come back in refreshed. What I tell now people to do, there is a person by the name of Jose Silva, who's no longer alive, but his system is alive, the Silva mindset piece. And you can listen to some of their like resetting, because if you can make your body so your body's relaxed under any situation, and you can have mental relaxation at the same time, you can be what's considered in an alpha state. So when you're in an alpha state, your body works better. You have that physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and social, and even financial part of it can come together much easier for you. So that's one of the things is it's like if you want to call it meditation, it's a 21-minute type of meditation that you can do to start your day. To be in your groove, be in your vibe, and then understand what the capacity is around it. Also, you can, besides that, you can make sure that you get your hydration in, and so when you're looking at your leadership people, and around you, you can do challenges. So like everyone can be on the same page. I went and worked with these people in Mississippi a couple years ago, and they have this really intense portion. And what we did is we designed a diet or food plan that everybody could be on. And so when they're on that food plan, what happens is that they have they're thinking better, they're working better, and they actually work in sync with each other. So those are things that and they can also buddy up so that they have an accountability partner. Which I always find that is very helpful for people when they're trying to elevate a whole team.
Yeah. And are there any highest impact habits the leaders can focus on to start with?
Well, let's start with an example of sleep consistency. Like when the way that somebody would do that is like wake up at the same time every day for the first week, and then going into the second week, like midday, have a nervous system reset where you would like take that, maybe do that 20-minute meditation type thing, and then go into looking at where your gaps are, and then using objective data and not guesswork. And so that then you can create a non-negotiable boundary for your energy. So the prioritizing sleep as a performance lever is a performance lever, not a luxury. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Cool. On that note, Dr. Bat, thanks for your time. This was really, in my view, very valuable conversation. It was a different topic for my podcast, to be honest, which focuses more on technology. But this was, I think, really important conversation to be had in this age when leaders are continuously under pressure. And this really gives us a very practical tips as to how they can improve their performance. And key takeaway is that when leaders talk about transformations, big changes, we organizations typically think of technology change, the business change, process change. But equally important, I think, is the human capability, the human capacity to absorb change, to navigate change, etc. And I think through this episode, we focused on that aspect well enough.
I just want to say one more thing. If you ask me what a leader should stop doing and start doing, they should stop treating exhaustion as proof of commitment. I mean, that's what we started our conversation with today. Yeah. And they should start measuring their performance inputs with the same rigor that how they apply it to business, and protect your recovery time as fiercely as you protect your clients' relationships, because ultimately you are the asset and the entire organization depends on you.
Well said, Dr. Pat. A great insight there. Thank you again. Thanks for your time. It was a pleasure hosting you. If you found this discussion valuable, please follow and subscribe to Enterprise Tech Talk. And thanks for listening. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.